Hey, my name's Alex and I made this music video. Zebra is a song by the artist Alec Hudson and features the rapper Cliff Notes. The video is filled with these special effects scenes where Alec and Cliff seamlessly pass through chunks of time. The film won many awards, including being nominated Best Music Video at the Boston Music Awards. It took 10 months to make this video, and it was done with zero budget. And here, I'm gonna show you guys how I made the video. Since this is gonna be kind of a long video, I put timecode links in the description below so you can jump around to different chapters. Let's go.
Who am I to say? Well, it's like a zebra. It can be hard to tell sometimes.
The song is all about how moments, good or bad, even though they may feel like they last forever, are just slices in the larger pattern we call time. Now, based on that concept, I thought it would be really cool if the video showed time as space, hence the time slice concept. Once we had the basic concept for the idea, Alec and I would brainstorm ideas as I doodled a storyboard. A lot of the inspirations for the video were just sort of imaginations that we came up with on the spot while listening to the song. But of course, we're also very influenced by other artists we're a fan of. Me, I'm a huge fan of Michel Gondry. And also Tous les mêmes by Stromae is a beautiful video which sort of shares the concept. As soon as we had a rough storyboard, I put it into Premiere and timed it to the music in what we call an animatic. This helped us see where sections of our storyboard were either too long or we really needed to add more. But since the concept we came up with was such a sort of visually vivid idea, the doodled storyboard didn't cut it. And the next thing we did is something I call a prototype edit. Basically what I do is scan through Adobe Premiere's libraries panel looking for stock footage that matches what we were asking for in the storyboard. I took that stock footage, laid it down in the timeline over those sections, and built a version of the entire video out of stock footage. In fact, in the very first cut of the video, Alec is played by various perky, smiling men and women. A number of the scenes that we came up with required pre-planning, like the therapy scene and the scenes during the chorus where Alec interacts with his friends. I enlisted my friend Molly Hess, who's an awesome dancer, and she helped us choreograph all the scenes where Alec interacts with other friends. She taught him how to spin and fall, and really was a great help in getting us to time everything with the music. Okay. There were other scenes like Cliff's section, the party scene, and the band scene, which were pre-planned but much more loosely, so we could be more flexible on the spot.
Do you want to be a keyboard player?
Keyboard. You guys look at each other and do something. Yeah. Take a joint.
Oh, that's gonna look sick.
As for the rest of the video, we really just left it pretty open. The storyboard just suggests different time slice effects and B-roll of Alec walking around. We weren't super sure what we'd show there, and this flexibility turned out to be a huge help. Now, before we committed ourselves to such a complex idea, I had to make sure we ran some tests. I did a lot of tests just filming with my iPhone 6S in day and night and messing around with the footage in Premiere. Now, of course, these tests proved that the concept was something that would work. In fact, some of the test shots, like the scene where there's a bike that goes from day to night, was a test that we actually ended up keeping in the final video. People often ask, did you guys just film the same thing in winter and spring and just line the shots up? And the basic answer is yes, plus a lot of post-production fudging. The whole idea of filming the same scene months apart and expecting things to line up sounds insane, because expecting things to work perfectly, especially with zero budget, would be insane. What kept us sane and made the whole project work was the fact that we didn't take things seriously. By not taking things too seriously, we weren't upset when things didn't work out, and we were open-minded enough to experiment and play around and spot when something accidentally worked awesome. Most of the video was done with my Sony a6300, and the Zhiyun crane was a huge help for stabilizing a lot of the shots. The drone shots were all done with the Parrot Anafi, which for under $600 is an amazing 4K drone. The scenes of Cliff driving were all filmed in 360 using my Insta360 Evo. Films in 5K and did pretty good low light. This allowed me to film those crazy wide angle and tiny world effects, and also allowed me to re-release that whole scene as a true 360 video. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and check it out, it's in the description. Last but not least, we have my iPhone 6S, which, believe it or not, a lot of the scenes in the video were filmed on in 4K. And talk about low budget filmmaking. To line up the shots, I just printed out a piece of paper with the previous shots that we were trying to line up and just eyeballed it. Another cheap filmmaking technique for lining up shots was to put some tape on my screen and draw the outlines of the shot in a marker so that I could line up the new shot with the outlined piece of tape. Pretty cool, and it worked for a lot of the shots. But to be perfectly honest, a lot of the lining up of scenes was just dumb luck.
Future Alex, I'm aligned so that it's like that. You get it.
We started filming in winter because it was winter, and as soon as snow started falling, we decided to take advantage of that, filming all of the sledding and snowball fighting shots up on Prospect Hill, just sort of on a whim that we hoped it would work out.
Oh my god, I'm sorry.
That was perfect.
Now, we figured most of the seasonal changes would probably look best in nature, so we went out and filmed Alec hiking in the nearby Middlesex Fells and Blue Hills. Some of those nature shots were planned, like the lake shot and the drone shot above the mountain peak. But a lot of the stuff we filmed in nature was really just winged. We would say, hey, that looks pretty. I bet it'll look cool in spring. And we would just film Alec walking back and forth, singing and not singing.
This way.
We're gonna remember this, I hope. It's a cool shot. If this log looks nice in spring, we can add plants to it.
Sick.
Later on in spring, we went back to the same locations we filmed in winter, and many of the shots, like, trees in front of vague snow,
See this tree? This is the tree that we are filming next to, and I'm right here, he's right there.
were impossible to find. Other locations we happened to stumble upon, filmed them, and they lined up perfectly. Weirdly perfect. Like, hey, isn't that the same rock you stepped on 4 months ago? I don't know. Maybe let's just film it. And bam, it was a perfect match. The rest of spring, summer, and fall were spent filming the more technically pre-planned shots. This includes all the scenes where Alec is walking around in the city, all the indoor shots, and also the cliff driving scene.
They ain't go the way I planned it, so I ain't had no other reason but to stop blaming planners.
We filmed this section of Cliff Notes' rap with a 360 camera and convertible, not just because it looks cool, but there were a couple other reasons. For example, he mentions driving and escaping and planets. Now with a 360 camera, you can do this cool effect called the tiny planet effect, where you zoom out so far that everything looks like it's in a tiny planet. Filming in 360 was also convenient because we didn't have a whole lot of time shooting with Cliff, and filming in all angles gave us the most options. We rented a convertible and I stuck my 360 camera to the windshield with a suction mount. When we met up with Cliff, he got in the car and drove us around Jamaica Plain in both rural and urban areas. Meanwhile, I actually hid in the back seat. You can actually find me if you look closely. I'm bent over hiding from the camera and playing the song on loop through a Bluetooth speaker, while I also monitor the 360 footage on my iPhone. Cliff did an amazing job safely driving around town while also rapping to the camera, and we were done with just a couple hours. And on my way back to return the rental car, I decided to start filming as I drove through the tunnel with a hunch that it could be useful in post. That hunch turned out to be right when I realized it was actually super easy to mask out Cliff and the car, enabling me to replace any background I want behind Cliff and the car. Now, I didn't have the convertible anymore and I couldn't use a car with a roof. So I actually went out with my bike. Yeah, that's me on my bike, going up and down the streets in the same place in day and night, biking through the cemetery, and I found that as long as I held the camera up high enough, the footage of me was small enough that the car would cover me up. There was still a little bit of fudging I had to do in post with angles, but I was super proud with the result considering all the circumstances. Later on, when I realized I could re-release the entire Cliff scene in 360 footage so people could look around with their phone, I actually got even more creative with the 360 background footage for Cliff, as we'll talk about later. These two little 5-second time-lapse clips actually took months to produce, and they were actually filmed and created in the back of my house.
Everything about the time-lapse box is improved, and it's for the next music video for Alec.
When working on my previous video called Let Bloom for Nati Vogel, I got really familiar with how to film time-lapse plants, and I actually built a custom time-lapse box that I put in the back of my house. It's basically a 2-foot square box with the inside painted blue, some grow lights above, and a permanently placed Canon T2i to capture the time-lapse. The blue screen let me key out the background so I could place plants wherever I want in Let Bloom. But for the scenes in Zebra, I wanted them to actually look like a real forest floor. So Alec and I planted some seeds in the planter, plopped in a mushroom log, and then covered the whole thing in forest floor that was actually made out of leaves and bark we found nearby our house. We blended up some ice for fake snow, layered that on top, and set the time lapse to start. I had the camera set to take photos every 10 minutes, and the light stayed on 24/7 for weeks. Now, to make sure nothing got disturbed while watering, for this project I actually built a self-watering and self-humidifying system, and you can learn a lot more about it on my website.
Proud of it, but basically, it all starts with this water pump. Can you look way fucking sadder? Okay, thank you.
Since I played the role of VFX artist and videographer and was super lucky to have a main actor that was really patient, reshoots were actually an option. Now, reshoots come with stigma, largely because it means you have to admit you screwed up and use some more time. But what I've learned through experience is that admitting failure is really just the first step to getting better at something. And in this case, we really couldn't argue with the fact that a few more hours in a reshoot would often save me days trying to fix it in post. Now, another reason we continued filming far beyond the initial storyboard is what I like to call the increased quality feedback loop. Basically, once we started adding special effects to certain scenes without any special effects look comparatively lamer. In fact, a lot of the feedback I got from friends during early screenings was that there didn't seem to be a consistent or a cohesive visual vibe. So we just basically came up with whole new scenes to replace the relatively uninteresting footage. But then, of course, when we raised the quality of those scenes, the bar was higher, and we looked at other shots and thought maybe we'd replace them. This cycle of continuously upping the quality of the shots went pretty close to the deadline, and as frightening as it may have been for Alec to hear, I have a whole cool new idea just a couple weeks before the deadline, he was super cool about it, and in the end, I think this flexibility is what gives the video a much more polished, finished product. Now, there was actually a point where we had too many concepts, and unfortunately, really cool scenes like this FaceTime effect where Alex sings as his facial hair time lapses look really cool on their own, but since they didn't fit the rest of the video, had to be trimmed way back. Trimmed. So you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that most of the time spent on this project was in post-production. I've been a VFX artist for over 13 years, which means I have tons of experience in Adobe Premiere and even more tons of experience in Adobe After Effects, both programs which I happen to teach professionally. My personal specialty has always been in what's called compositing, which is basically layering different pieces of footage to create special effects. Now, if I went into absolute detail about every effect and process I used to make Zebra, this video would be days long. So instead, what I've done is I've taken the main types of effects and categorized them into the following categories.
Split screen, keying and masking or rotoscoping, camera tracking, building custom assets for overlay, distortion and displacement effects, time displacement, and VFX tricks for 360.
Split screen is an effect that's been around since the beginning of film. It's pretty simple, and it's basically just layering two clips on top of each other and trimming the top one back. I usually use an effect called linear white, which exists in Premiere and After Effects. In fact, a lot of the effects were actually done in Premiere. For scenes where the time slice wasn't a straight line, I used what's called a mask, which is like taking scissors to a photo, and it's actually something you can do at Adobe Premiere, but I did most of it in Adobe After Effects. Now, the most important thing to get a split screen effect to work would be your timing and framing alignment. Now, sometimes we would just get really lucky, and two shots would happen to line up in time or space. For example, like this scene where two different bikers in day and night just happen to line up. But to line up the majority of the shots, there usually required some amount of fudging in time or framing. When the timing of two different clips didn't line up just right, I would usually just change the speed of one of the clips. Or if I needed more timing adjustment, I would use something called time remapping. It's a feature that you can technically do in Premiere, but it's much more powerful in Adobe After Effects. Now, if the two clips didn't exactly line up in terms of framing, I could usually fix most of this with some scaling, positioning, and rotation effects on one of the clips. To fix tougher misalignments in position or framing, I usually had to resort to distortion effects like mesh warp or liquefy in After Effects, and we talk about that in the distortion section. Basic time split effect is pretty cool, but in a lot of the scenes, I kick it up a notch by actually adding some perspective. This allows us to see the subject actually leaving their own time frame while sort of showing up on top of it, as if they're going through a plane of time. Now, in order for this effect to work, I had to isolate parts of a subject to be placed in front of backgrounds that they were not ever in front of. This idea of isolating parts of footage is generally called rotoscoping. and it's a technique that's been around since the beginning of film. It's truly amazing what Georges Méliès was able to do back in the day with optical-only effects, but today we isolate subjects with keying and masking. Now, I'm normally a huge fan of green screen and use it in lots of my videos, but in this video we needed Alec to interact with the scenes so realistically that 90% of the footage is just filmed with Alec actually on location, no green screen whatsoever. Could we have brought one to maybe help us out on location? Yeah, probably. But we didn't. So the question is, without green screen, how can you get parts of your subject to be isolated from the rest of the footage? Sometimes I would just get lucky and Alec would be in front of a smooth color, in which case I could key it out with key light, or in front of a uniform brightness, in which case I could use Luma key. But to key out non-uniform backgrounds, one trick is to use many instances of the color key effect, precisely isolating the exact colors that you want to remove and being careful not to strip out any colors of the subject. Now, sometimes it's actually easier to reverse this process, isolating only the colors of the subject with color keys. Then you can invert the transparency by reversing the curve on the alpha channel in RGB curves. Now, there's one last trick that only works if the background doesn't move much and you film it on a tripod. You can make 2 copies of your clip and then freeze frame one of them at a moment when your subject isn't in the scene. Then, using an effect called difference matte, you can tune the effect to key out areas where the 2 clips are the same. This should leave only your subject. Now, keying any kind of background that is naturally occurring and not a smooth screen is going to result in some really scraggly results. Luckily, there are lots of effects built in After Effects for cleaning up this isolation layer, or what we call matte layer. Some of those include Simple Choker, Matte Choker, and my favorite, Refined Soft Matte Effect, which is a really great, almost intelligent noise removal effect, which works great, but never works right out of the box and does usually require lots of tweaking and tuning. Once I had this cleaned up and isolated version of Alec, my powers were pretty much limitless. If Alec was ever in front of a background that was not an even color or brightness, or even more complex would be scenes where Alec interacts with other people or the scene itself, keying was just pretty much out of the question. And the last and only tool left would be manually masking or rotoscoping out Alec from the scene. Now, masking is basically like taking scissors to a photograph, except of course digitally, and usually done in After Effects, though it's also possible in Premiere. Now, creating a mask for a frozen frame is not too hard. But of course, getting the mask to follow someone who moves through the scene is a whole nother story. For very simple, basic movements, I could get away with keyframing the shape of my mask. But in some cases, Alec's movements were so drastic and so complex that a single mask in After Effects wasn't enough. And I had to use another really awesome effect in After Effects called Mocha AE. The Mocha tracking plugin that comes with After Effects is basically a camera tracking effect and a masking effect in one. In Mocha, I would start by drawing a rough mask for the region of the subject I would like to follow. This could then automatically track the footage and guess where they move. Next, I would draw a more detailed mask in Mocha to actually outline the sections I want to isolate. A quick and important tip for anyone doing complex masking is to create multiple masks for different parts of the subject. For example, having a separate head and arm mask is going to make your life a lot easier when the arm moves a lot but the head doesn't. Once I had my subject tracked and I gave it my masks, the masks would naturally move along with the tracking information. And this would get me pretty far. Now, of course, the Mocha tracker wasn't able to force my masks to follow very minute changes of my subject. And so in the end, the best technique is to combine this auto tracking with manual keyframes to correct for any mistakes. Now, once I've got what I think looks like a good track and mask in Mocha, I would turn the Mocha effect in After Effects into a matte, and bam, I would have a version of my layer where the subject is isolated despite all the complex movement. These masking effects were also often used to create other really unique results. For example, if I wanted Alec to walk straight through a plane of time, I would simply create 2 masks. One that was vaguely topographical, highlighting things like his forehead, cheekbones, and nose, and then I would animate what's called the expansion. starting with it contracted and expanding the mask outward to fill the entire already isolated version of Alec. And that's how I did these cool walking through time plane effects, plus some cool rippling effects that we'll talk about in the distortion section. Masking was also heavily used in the 360 scenes with Cliff. For example, to put Cliff and the car in front of backgrounds that he wasn't actually in front of, I would actually just create masks in Premiere. Getting a mask to stick to your footage turned out to be really easy with 360 because the camera is naturally stabilized. Becoming a mask master gives you so much power in compositing. Now you may have noticed that in this whole section, I didn't once mention the Roto Brush tool. That's because while I was making Zebra, the original version stank. But since then, Adobe has updated to Roto Brush version 2, and it uses machine learning, and it's amazing. I almost certainly would have used it if I did Zebra again. Speaking of machine learning, AI is coming and is going to change so much about the post-production world, especially rotoscoping. So we're on the threshold of some crazy things in the rotoscoping and masking world. So keep an eye out, and I may even post some tutorials on that stuff once I have it all figured out myself.
Life is just a series of arbitrary numbers.
Now, there are a number of scenes in Zebra where elements seem stuck to the scene despite the fact that the camera is moving around. And this is a process known as camera tracking. Camera tracking technology has been getting really good over the years, and heck, you can do camera tracking with Instagram now. Now, for some of these scenes, getting an effect to look like it was stuck despite camera movement was easy because the camera movement was actually fake. It was a digital scale or pan animation that I actually did using an effect called transform effect, and it's really actually something you can do right in Premiere. It's a really cool, underrated effect, and I'll often add the transform effect to an adjustment layer and put that above all my other clips, and that way I can do all kinds of cool digital camera pans and zooms on my 4K footage with the effects already added underneath. But there are definitely a lot of scenes in Zebra where there's real camera movement and effects are stuck to the scene anyway. And this is thanks to some real camera tracking. There's an actual camera tracking button built right into After Effects, which adds a camera tracking effect to your footage. This effect scans the footage and triangulates any movement to figure out how the real camera actually moved around to film that scene. With that new camera information, After Effects can build a virtual copy of the real camera in 3D space inside of After Effects. And once you've got that 3D camera, all you need to do to make some sort of element appear to be stuck to your two-dimensional video is put it in 3D space, the correct distance and orientation relative to your 3D camera. The fact that your 3D camera moves past your element in just the same way that your real camera bobbed and moved past some part of your scene means that the two will sync up. And the three-dimensional layer that you've put in your scene will look stuck to your two-dimensional footage. It's hard to explain, but it's actually really easy to do. This cool time freeze frame effect is actually not too hard to do. All I had to do was camera track my layer to get my virtual camera. Then I took a freeze frame of my video at a certain moment with the timer map effect. I then used the mask tools to mask out the frozen frame, and since it doesn't move, that wasn't too hard. The last thing to do was to take that masked out frozen frame and simply make it 3D and position it the correct distance from my camera so that it appeared to be stuck to the floor. Bam! Now I've got these frozen versions of Alec and Clara stuck to the scene, and they can move around. All right, I lied. There's a little bit more going on in this scene. For example, the shadows that stay stuck to the ground, that was another instance of a fake shadow that had to be put in 3D space and respond to my camera. Then, of course, there's the whole fact that Alec is able to walk in front of his own frozen frame, which took a lot of fancy rotoscoping. And then there's Sean, who walks in front of everything. Damn it, Sean. Now, one of the most complicated camera tracking scenes in Zebra is this scene where Cliff has to transition from the 360 video to being stuck to an actual record player. Fun fact, Cliff was actually supposed to be put into a snow globe. We brought a snow globe to the set, and you know, snow globes are fragile, so record player. The easy part here was actually camera tracking the movement. I put a 3D solid layer at the correct distance from the camera as a stand-in for Cliff. Now, to get Cliff to actually look like he's on a record player, there was this cool coincidence where I noticed that when I go to fisheye mode with the 360 footage, anytime Cliff drives near a wall, the wall gets flattened out and looks like he's driving on a big disc. And so that's what I did, is I time remapped that background so that it was near the wall right at the right time. I then used some masks to cut away the sky, and now I had Cliff on a disc. Now, to get the Cliff footage to look more like it's at the correct angle, I used a really cool angle sort of adjustment tool called corner pin. I used the corner pin to match Cliff to the record player, but that meant that all the Cliff footage was now distorted strangely. If I undistorted the Cliff footage, I would have had to distort the record player, and now the record scene would look weird. Now, to compromise for these two issues, I actually put another instance of the corner pin effect on an adjustment layer and put it over both Cliff and the record player. I distorted Cliff to match the record player, but then undistorted him on the top adjustment layer so that he looked normal at the beginning. I keyframed this top adjustment layer corner pin, so it starts with the clip of Cliff looked unwarped and the record player warped, but by the time we're more focused on the record player, Cliff is now more warped and the record player is not. And that seemed to smooth things out in addition to my camera tracking. All I had to do then was put a little bit of a camera lens blur effect on the Cliff footage to match the fact the record was blurring as it went to the background. So there were a fair number of assets and overlays that you'll see in Zebra that weren't actually filmed. Like this rain, this sky, this chalkboard, that car, and this window. Maybe you didn't see that last one. But perhaps the most obvious overlay in Zebra is what I call the zebrification scene. When I first started trying to stick the lines to people and the scene, I went through all sorts of techniques like motion tracking, camera tracking, and even this crazy concept known as projection mapping, and I spent countless hours before just stumbling upon one effect that did exactly what I wanted instantly. This was the Colorama effect. The Colorama effect takes a gradient of your video and replaces it with a custom gradient. In this case, I turned the gradient into a looping black and white pattern, and bam, that's it. Instant zebrification. The reason this works is that all the gradients on people's skin tones and the walls move as they move. So the zebra patterns seem to move with them. And just totally in 10 seconds, I did what would have taken hours with tracking. In the end, I did a little bit of rotoscoping and keying skin tones so the patterns stay to their skin and not over their clothes. When I figured out how easy the Colorama effect was, I went a little crazy and I made an entire version of the video where Alex's face is just constantly zebrifying with this pattern. But that didn't make the cut. In the end, when I figured out that the Colorama effect was so easy to make, I did feel kind of stupid having spending so many hours trying other techniques. Which is a reminder of two things. One, always keep playing. Even if you think you have a technique that works, there might be an easier method right around the corner. Also, if it's hard, you're either doing it wrong, or learning, or both. Now, some assets did use special effects. Like, for example, for rain, I used the CC rainfall effect. I tweaked the motion blur and speed to get it just right. Now, to make it look like the droplets were soaking the scene, I made two other solids, one for the wall and one for the ground. I then added another instance of the CC rainfall effect to those solids, but I gave them a 0 speed. Then I animated the number of droplets so little dots would appear as if they were soaking the ground. Now, when I needed assets that didn't need to move so tightly to subjects, I would basically just build those assets in Photoshop or After Effects, like I did with the chalkboard, and then just place them in the scene and camera track anything that needs to be camera tracked. This shot of the car going from day to night in the traffic circle is actually fully photoshopped from an image of a car I edited from the internet. And interesting fact, there is an actual instance of Cliff that I took from the real 360 footage of him in the car. I masked it out and placed it into the photo of the car. So he's really in there. I used some keyframe animation to have it drive around the circle. I made the night version with some intense color correction of the day version, color corrected the car, and then gave its lights some light beam by parenting some adjustment layers with masks to the car. I then layered the entire night version over the day version and split it with a linear wipe effect that was rotating. And I used a bit of displacement map, which we'll learn about in a second, to have the night and day split sort of hug the profile of the details in the scene. All right, so this is the biggest animated asset in Zebra, the giant zebrified Earth. It's entirely done in After Effects, and it starts with 2 layers. There's the day and night, basically equirectangular of Earth. These maps you can find online through lots of websites, including NASA. Now you get an equirectangular image by splitting and stretching out a sphere into a rectangle. Yes, it's distorted, but that's good for us so that later on when we turn it back into a sphere, everything lines up. In one composition, I layered the day and night images over each other. I used the pen tool to make 2 lines with different thicknesses. Then I used the repeater shape effect to pattern these lines down. To get those lines to be all wobbly and bent, I used the turbulent displace effect. I used some keyframes and expressions to keep those lines wobbling. Then I set the day map's track matte to trace this shape layer. Now we've got wobbly, stripy, day-night Earth map. Then I selected all 3 of these super high resolution layers and pre-composed them. Then I changed the resolution of the comp I was working on back to a normal size. This left us with a super high resolution of the map, which will help later on when I zoom into the globe. Now to turn the whole map into an actual sphere, I use the awesome, underrated CC sphere effect, which basically just wraps an equirectangular around a sphere. The CC sphere effect comes with all kinds of options for rotation and shading, which I then adjusted and keyframed to get the Earth to spin just enough. The background for this scene was basically just a star map that moves a little bit, and for the sun, I used an instance of the optical flares plugin. There was actually another way that I was going to end this video by pulling out with a drone shot of Somerville and making it stripy, but I did my best to make the stripes match the drone shot. It looks all right, but it was a little too janky and just too many options for that ending, so it didn't make the cut. Next, we've got these time-lapse plants that are attached to this video of a log. Now, all of those time-lapse plants were filmed in my time-lapse box, which I talk about in the previous filming section. And I cut them out with the key light effect in After Effects. Now, I placed them on the log, color corrected them a bit, but also needed some masking to make it blend in and match the log. But now here's the real question, which is, how did I get this snow to melt? Now, there are lots of ways in After Effects that you can bend and warp footage. And I'd put them into 2 main categories, being distortion and displacement effects. I use those for different purposes. I would usually use distortion effects to help line up the time wipes. Where you see Alec in winter and where you see him in spring are actually Alec filmed in winter and spring. And of course, as you'd expect, it was hard to get those to line up perfectly. Sometimes it did, but most times it needed a little fudging. And for that fudging, I would usually use a combination of the mesh warp effect to move larger sections around, and liquefy to move smaller chunks, little bits, aligning limbs and stuff like that. I used the corner pin effect when I needed to distort images as a whole to match a different plane or camera angle, and is often used in combination with camera tracking, as I mentioned in that section. I would use displacement effects for situations whenever I wanted the warping to actually animate, for situations like melting or rippling. The displacement map effect is really cool. The way it works is it will shift the position of pixels on one clip based on the pixel values of another clip we call the map. To do the melting snow, I started by making a map layer with a gradient that animates from left to right. Then I added the fractal noise effect to this gradient and set its blending mode to overlay, giving the gradient a rougher texture, which will translate to a rougher melting like real snow. Then I could turn the visibility for this animating gradient off, since it's only going to be used as a reference. We don't want to actually see it. I would then take an instance of the displacement map effect and put it on the original footage. I would tell the effect to reference our map layer and make sure that it's set to read the layer's effects, since those are driving the rough gradient. Since the gradient map is black and white, I told the displacement map effect to reference its luminance values. Then I moved the playhead about halfway through the gradient animation and told the displacement map effect to push the pixels vertically down because we want it to melt. And that's pretty much all we needed. Since the gradient animates on its own, so does the snow. Anywhere the gradient goes from black to white, the snow goes from up to down as it references the map. Now, to get the snow to actually dissolve as it melts, I would also use the same map layer as a reference. But instead of telling it to displace, I would tell it to do something called a track matte. And a track matte, you're basically telling the black and white values of one layer to drive the opacity of the layer below. Now remember, maps are used for reference in effects, mattes are used for tracing opacity. In the middle of recording this tutorial, Adobe came out with a huge update. Track mattes no longer have to reference the layer directly above. You can now reference any layer with this dropdown or pick whip. This means you can put your matte above or below your original layer or anywhere in a stack of layers. And what's really cool is you can actually have multiple layers reference the same matte. We also now use these checkboxes to determine whether it's an alpha or luma matte, or if it's inverted. This update is huge. Ripples. Ripples were a cool idea that I pretty much added at the last minute. It's like a cherry on top, and I'm really glad I did. I think it added a lot to the video. Now to build these ripples, I made a different looking map. I basically made an animating black to white map out of an actual video of rippling water. Once I had this map, I turned up the contrast because that's what was going to be used as the reference for the displacement map. The next thing I would do is take these ripple map comps and place them in my scene when and wherever someone passes through a time plane. I also often needed to keyframe them to move along with any camera movements. Once I had all my ripples in the right places and times, I wrapped those all up into one pre-comp to convert them into a single overlying master ripples comp, which had all the rippling in the right places and times. Now inside this ripples pre-comp, I filled the background with a white solid and then turned the blending mode of the actual ripples to darken, allowing the ripples to mix with each other and the background smoothly. The next thing I would do is take an instance of that displacement map effect and tell it to reference this master ripples composition. But I wouldn't add the effect to just one clip. Instead, I added the displacement map effect to an adjustment layer. I would put this adjustment layer with the displacement map effect above the background so it ripples, but below any isolated elements of the person passing through the time frame because they shouldn't be distorted. Now the displacement map effect is great, but sometimes you can do one better with the CC glass effect. CC glass effect has the same basic displacement feature, but with the addition of some really great features like simple height adjustment and softness to easily smooth out the waves. You can even add lighting effects to the ripples, which makes them even more realistic. It's just a really powerful effect and can do all kinds of crazy stuff. I also added a similar rippling effect to this time circle expansion scene to give it a little bit more oomph. I'm not sure everybody noticed it, but I think it helped. Time wave. Man, when I first got this thing to work, I was freaking out. I'm a huge fan of time-lapse, and I think this is just a super cool way to mess with it. The whole idea was that the scenes around this time-lapse clip were moving horizontally. There was a wave of movement, and I thought, what if instead of the plants growing and dying up to down, it was left to right? Luckily, there is an effect right in After Effects that actually allows time to happen at different places on the screen with what's called a time displacement effect. It's really cool. Now, the way it works is very similar to a normal displacement map, but instead of distorting the pixels of the clip based on your reference map, it will delay their time. So wherever your reference map is darker, your clip is earlier, and wherever it's brighter, it's later on in time. And so for this situation, all I had to do was build a reference map with a gradient with black on the left and white on the right. I added the time displace effect to my already made time-lapse clip, told the time displace to reference it, and that was it. Instant time wave. Oh man, this thing is super cool. Getting time displacement to work is pretty easy. But as soon as you start asking questions like, what makes it go left versus right? Why does it squish and stretch? And what's with these blocky slices? As soon as you start to look under the hood, it's kinda complicated. Now you probably understand that what you see on the screen over time is just like watching a film strip go through a projector. Time displacement basically turns your screen into a slice. This is also why sometimes the effect is called slit scanning. But instead of just one slit, it's enough to fill the screen. Each slit, though, points to a different part of your film strip, with the left side referencing a black gradient being delayed and the right side referencing a white gradient being advanced, all referencing the same film strip, which will hopefully explain as it starts to play why the wave moves from left to right. The sprouting occurs on the right side of the screen first and then eventually makes its way to the left. By the time the left side starts sprouting, the right side is already finishing its death sequence, which then also propagates down to the left. The time displacement value determines how far back in time the black areas are and how far advanced the white areas are, and turning this up will basically condense more time to fit on the screen at once. In other words, the density of the time wave. The number of time slices that your video is cut up into is determined by the time resolution in the displacement effect. The default is 60, which to some degree explains why the lines are so chunky to start off. And turning up the time resolution will usually shrink these lines and create finer detail in the displacement. But at some point you will notice that turning the number up any higher doesn't make the lines any thinner. So what's going on with this? Let's say we have a time offset of 1, meaning we're showing 1 second into the past on the left and 1 second into the future on the right. Or in other words, we have a total of 2 seconds of time spread across the entire screen in space. In order to understand how finely we can cut up space, we need to understand how finely we can cut up time. In other words, what are the finest increments that 1 second is made out of? Frames. In other words, if this video is, let's say, 60 frames per second, I have a maximum time resolution of 60 slices per 1 second chunk on the screen. This is why turning the time resolution value over 60 doesn't give us any more slices. There just isn't any more of that information we can extract from the clip. This is why when you're planning to use the time displacement effect, it's best to film and work with clips that have a very high frame rate. But let's assume your original clip is only 60 frames per second. There is actually a way to create in-between frames where there originally weren't any. Frame blending is something you may or may not have heard about, which helps create in-betweens when slowing down footage. Interestingly, it will also work here to create new frames that the time displacement effect would be calling for, even though we're not actually slowing the clip down. In other words, with frame blending turned on, we can turn the time resolution up, and After Effects will always try to create that many individual new frames for that many slices. This is going to really hurt your computer, since frame blending, especially with the higher quality pixel motion method, is already a really render intensive effect. And then on top of that, we have time displacement. Creating extremely smooth, high resolution time displacement is going to be hard on your computer, so just keep that in mind. But let's say for the sake of argument, you are trying to get the highest quality possible. What is the time resolution that we would need? Well, if the width of our image is made out of 1920 pixels, and our time displacement effect is spreading 2 seconds of our clip across that many pixels, each second would cover 960 pixels. And in order to have a unique frame for each pixel, our time displacement effect would have to have 960 frames per second. Now, while my computer completely overheats trying to render that many frames, let's take a quick second to talk about something else that might limit the total resolution you can see on the screen with time displacement. Bit depth. After Effects' default 8-bit color depth means you can only have 255 notches of dynamic range along any color, or in this case, luminance. Since this color ramp is driving our displacement map, what this really means is that in 8-bit mode, you can only have 255 notches or displacement slices across the total screen. If you're going to need more than that, or in our case, 1920 across the whole screen, you're going to need to up your bit depth to the next level, which is 16. However, this gives you 32,768 notches in your dynamic range, which is way more than we need. So in 16-bit, we can rule that out as a limiting factor. Now, after over 10 minutes, After Effects is still chugging away, trying to process those 960 frames per second using frame blending, and then on top of that, trying to do the time displacement. And that's actually the key to our solution. If we can separate out these two tasks, process one at a time, and turn that result into a finished video clip, also known as a pre-render, we can make things a lot easier on After Effects and significantly reduce processing time. So I've put the raw video clip into a pre-comp, and I would get ready to export this at 960 frames per second thanks to frame blending if it wasn't for the fact that After Effects has a maximum output frame rate of only 120 frames per second. So what are we going to do? Well, we can work around this problem if you think about our needs as not 960 frames per second in our timeline necessarily, but we need 960 frames per second of the original video. We can do 960 divided by 120, which is a factor of 8. So if we just slow our video clip down 8 times, 1 second of our clip will turn into 8 seconds. Those 960 frames we need for those now 8 seconds can easily be stored in 120 frame increments for each second in our timeline. In the end, we get a video that's super long, but in terms of the original content of our video, is jam-packed with all that extra time information. This is still going to take a pretty long time to render. But once that's done, we can bring that pre-rendered clip back into After Effects. Since this version is slowed way down, there are a few ways we can deal with that. One option is just to leave it slowed down, and then when applying the time displacement to this clip, adjust the values accordingly. Since the slowed version is 8 times slower, we need 8 times as many seconds that we're actually displacing. But since we're showing more seconds on the screen, we need fewer frames per second for our resolution, and we can reduce this by 8, bringing 960 back down to 120, which is exactly how many frames per second our clip has. Now, even though this will process much faster than trying to do frame blending and time displacement at the same time, it's still not going to render in a snap. And with my settings and setup, it took about a minute per frame. Now, considering my slowed down version is about 36 seconds long, and at 120 frames per second, 36 seconds would take 4,320 minutes or 72 hours. And if you could dedicate your computer to rendering for 3 days, you would get a gorgeously smooth and slow motion version of your clip. Slow motion just adds to the coolness of the time displacement. But let's say you can't afford to have your computer rendering for 3 days. You probably don't need your final output video to be this slow. So we can speed it up. One option is to go to the project panel, right-click on the clip and go to Interpret Footage, and tell After Effects to treat this clip as if it had 960 frames per second. Increasing the interpreted frame rate by 8 also increases the clip's speed by 8, bringing it from 36 seconds down to its original 4 seconds, essentially giving us a type of clip we couldn't actually export from After Effects, a 4-second clip with 960 frames per second in it. And as for the values in the time displacement effect, we can actually leave them as the same values we had originally at 1 second of displacement and 960 frames per second, which again is exactly how much the clip has. I found that this also takes about 1 minute per frame to render, but now I only have about 4.5 seconds I'm trying to output. And I also probably don't need my final output clip to be 120 frames per second. I could go with something more reasonable like 60. 60 frames per second times 4.5 seconds means this render will only take about 270 minutes or roughly 4.5 hours, which is much more doable. This will still give me that beautifully smooth time displacement, and now the clip is playing at the speed I probably want. I still have that 60 frames per second though that I can use to slow it down by about half if I want a bit of a slow motion effect. Now, since there are so many ways to change speed in After Effects, I actually went through all of them, testing the various methods of changing your clip speed from that long slowed render clip back down to the original duration and speed we wanted, with methods like time stretch in the timeline and time remapping. And while strangely some of these methods had the time displacement effect thinking the clip was still long, meaning I needed the longer time displacement values, and others let the effect correctly interpret the clip's new speed in the timeline, with all methods I found that it took about the same time to render, about 1 minute per frame with my settings. In any case, thanks to the fact that we've pre-rendered our frame blending and increased the time density or frames per second of the original clip to match that of our required resolution on the screen, we can finally get that maximum amount of beautifully smooth time displacement. Oh man, this thing is super cool.
No, today ain't go the way I planned it, so I ain't had no other reason but to stop blaming planners. That could be an advantage if you
Working in 360. This was my first time working in 360, and I actually ended up really loving the workflow. I worked with an Insta360 Evo. That's a really cool camera that can also turn 3D. It's great because it records in 5K, so it's really nice resolution, and it's also pretty good at low light. And the workflow is super simple. In fact, you can actually edit the raw footage in Premiere with a simple plugin. But I actually ended up using proxies because 5K is really huge, and so I ended up creating MP4 proxies of all the footage. The latest versions of Premiere have also made editing in 360 really cool. There are basically two options. You can look at your footage in its original equirectangular format, which is basically all directions stretched out into a big rectangle, so it's a bit distorted, or you can look at it with the 360 viewer, which is very similar to the way you would look at it if you actually had watched your video on a phone or a device. Now, the 360 viewer didn't actually make sense for my situation because my plan was to put the 360 footage in a normal 16:9 video, so I did all my editing in equirectangular format. Once we had all that figured out, it was time for the actual editing. And since I did lots of takes of Cliff driving around in Jamaica Plain, we had to basically sync them up using roughly the multicam workflow in Premiere, although there was still a lot of manual adjustment to get things to line up. Now, sometimes these 360 clips would come in with slightly different angles, probably because the camera shifted between takes. In order to line these shots up, we have a built-in effect in Premiere called VR Rotate Sphere. When making adjustments and looking at the equirectangular, this just seems to warp and deform the image for reasons we'll understand later. But these very same deformations when viewed under a 360 viewer translate into the sphere actually appearing to rotate in alignment. I continued using this VR Rotate Sphere effect on each clip until they were all lined up before I went on and did any other editing. Once I had everything synced up, I just went through and picked my favorite takes of Cliff for each section. Once I had a take of Cliff rapping that I liked, I started to notice that the backgrounds were really lacking and wanted to know if there was anything else we could do. And I had a hunch that we could actually replace the backgrounds. In the end, it actually turns out to be really easy to do masking with 360 footage, especially with a fixed mounted 360 camera. All I had to do was create a mask with the pen tool on the opacity property in Premiere, and I drew around Cliff and the car. Since the camera was fixed to the car, any mask I drew on the footage pretty much stayed put and didn't need to be animated or tracked in any way. Bam! Now I've got a whole take of Cliff rapping without any backgrounds, and I can put whatever backgrounds I want behind him. Now, I had also filmed some footage of me driving in the tunnel in the hunch that this would work out, and I added that in certain places. But then I really started to get greedy. I wanted to add scenes that I didn't actually film when I had the convertible. And so I actually went back out with my 360 camera on the end of a pole, and I rode around on my bike filming things in day and night. As long as I had the camera high up enough above me, I looked small and could be covered up by the actual masked car. Once I figured out that this worked out, I filmed all sorts of footage. I filmed day and night in the same locations. I filmed traffic circles, cemeteries, and just getting 360 footage so I could put Cliff pretty much wherever I could film. And it turned out great. But now that I had all these extra backgrounds, I had to basically re-edit the scene in another sequence, only focusing on backgrounds, timing things like day and night to the music. Lastly, I just took the entire edited section of Cliff rapping masked with him in the car and put it on top of the sequence of the backgrounds. There was a good bit of extra fudging and masking and time adjustments, but that's basically the gist of the editing portion. The next thing to do was to take this edit, which is currently equirectangular, showing all directions at once, and make it only look in one direction at a time, just like the rest of the video, which was filmed on a normal camera. Luckily, there is a plugin for Premiere called the GoPro Reframe plugin. What the GoPro Reframe plugin does is take your equirectangular and wrap it into a 360 world and creates a virtual camera pointing in a certain direction in that world. What you can do is edit that camera's rotation and even the framing, going from normal 50mm normal camera framing out to super wide angle, even fisheye tiny planet effect, which you see in certain areas. I added the GoPro Reframe plugin to an adjustment layer and put it above all my clips. This way I only needed one instance of the plugin. All I had to do then was keyframe these rotations and framing changes so that the camera looks at the right place with the right framing at the right time given what's going on in the scene. Hey, it's me from the future again, letting you know that GoPro's FX Reframe plugin now has a whole bunch more features, including improvements to the reframing like motion blur is added, but most importantly, we now have a separate set of settings just for realigning the clips prior to those adjustments. This means that Premiere's built-in VR Rotate Sphere effect isn't really necessary anymore. You can do all 360 adjustments and reframing right inside the FX Reframe plugin. Nice job, GoPro. In the end, there were so many options that this decision about where to look was actually a little overwhelming. That's something I learned about 360. Now that the camera animations were roughly set, all I had to do was add overlays and transitions.
Ain't a damn thing changed but the length of the designated driver.
Now my time wipe transitions in 360 were actually really easy thanks to the built-in VR wipe transitions in Premiere that are designed to work with 360. They basically take a little pinhole and stretch it around the world so that it looks like you're going from one scene to the other. And this built-in movement worked perfectly because it corresponded with the forward movement of Cliff driving down the road.
I'm gonna need some hope to clean up all this garbage.
Let's talk about making VFX overlays for 360. There are basically two main ways to apply overlay footage to a 360 video. You can either stick that piece of video to a specific place in the 360 world, or you can have it wrap entirely around the world, like I did with this scene of the rain coming down around Cliff in the car. Now, remember, 360 footage in its raw format is this equirectangular, as if you've unrolled a sphere onto a flat surface. If you take an individual element, let's say some text, or in this case, a clip of lightning, and place it anywhere on that equirectangular, technically, once you roll it back into a sphere, either with the V-Frame plugin or Premiere's built-in VR viewer, it will be part of that world. But remember, the 360 viewer and VR effects are designed to deform equirectangulars to look correct. If the original assets you're adding don't have equirectangular deformations, these VR effects and viewers will actually stretch them to look wrong. This is more obvious when you try to apply something like a rectangle or text. You'll notice that by default, it looks strangely warped. This is where Premiere's built-in plane to sphere effect comes in handy, applying the correct equirectangular deformations so your asset retains its original flat-looking proportions even in a 360 view. But what if you want to create assets that actually wrap around the 3D spherical world itself? Like, for example, the rain in this shot. Now, to create the actual rain, no surprise, I used After Effects. I started trying out the default CC rain effect to get the rain. When I took that single sheet of rain falling vertically, brought it into Premiere, and put it under the 360 effects, the rain did wrap around and looked pretty cool. I probably could have gotten away with it. But I found an issue when I rotated to look directly up or down. The way the VR reframe and 360 viewer effects work causes all the pixels at the top of your video clip to merge into single points in the poles at the top and bottom of your world. I thought the result just didn't look right and wondered if there was something I could do that was better. So this time I tried a different approach and started with the CC starburst effect. This makes it look as though particles are coming at you, just like rain would if you looked up. And this is exactly what I wanted at the top of my 360 world. If I just took this normal rectangular version of the starburst effect, brought it into Premiere, and 360'd it, it does wrap around the sphere. But there are two problems. Number one, the visuals of particles coming at me is in front, not above. And number two, if I do look above, I still see that cinching problem that we get because of the way things wrap. Now I can solve problem number one with the VR rotate sphere effect that we talked about earlier. This rotates the spherical projection, so now the particles coming at me are actually above and this part looks correct. Problem number two though isn't solved with the rotate sphere effect. I still have cinching. It's just now on the sides instead of the top and bottom. To solve this cinching effect, we really need to unpack how this whole 360 wrapping concept first comes about. 360 footage in its raw form right out of the camera actually appears as two circles, each one containing 180-degree views. When you use your 360 camera's app to convert this raw content into video, it stretches these two circles into two squares, allowing the perimeters of these two circles, which would be a continuation of that 360 view, to actually stretch out and meet on linear edges. The reason 360 footage doesn't cinch once re-wrapped into 360 is because the top and bottom are literally made out of these pre-stretched points that were at the tops and bottoms of the circles. With this little demonstration, you can see how the VR rotate sphere effect actually works on the X, Y, and Z axes. With circles, it seems to make sense, but once those circles are stretched into squares, you have these strange deformations. This hopefully also clears up why the rotate sphere effect is able to move my starburst from the center to the top by rotating on the x-axis, but simultaneously causes what was on the tops and bottoms to squish out to the sides into these other cinches. So now, back to the rectangular CC starburst clip. If you think about it, this effect, once cropped into a circle, very much simulates what you would see with a 180-degree view. If only there was a way to convert it into an equirectangular the way the 360 app does. Guess what? There's an effect right in After Effects called VR Converter. It's a very powerful effect, and it basically does what 360 apps do and a whole bunch more. If we put this effect on our CC starburst clip and set the input to fisheye, then set the output to equirectangular, the VR converter, just like the 360 app, stretches those edges to make a rectangle. But there's still another problem. Real 360 footage is made out of two circles, not one. Meaning with this new equirectangularly stretched square, we only have enough footage for half a sphere once rewrapped in 360. Now there are two ways to solve this problem. The quick and dirty method would be to tell the VR converter that this circle doesn't just contain 180 degree view, but a full 360, this will continue to stretch the edges of what was originally that circle outward in an equirectangular format to fill the entire screen, which will then appropriately translate once wrapped in 360 to smooth stretching around a sphere. This means there won't be any cinching at the tops or bottoms. But when 360 degrees is actually stored in a circle, the outer edges of that circle are actually supposed to represent what would be at the back of this sphere. In our case, the edges of our circle don't represent that and just have particles going in random directions. So when those edges are stretched back into a seamless point at the back, we do have this cinching effect. It's certainly a better result than we had without using the converter effect, and technically solves all the problems we need solved. It has a really realistic view of the snow coming at us, which can easily be rotated to be above us using the VR rotate sphere effect. And the sides also look great. The only cinching point, which is now at the bottom, can actually just be covered up with the image of Cliff and the car. So yeah, that's the quick and dirty method, and to be honest, the method I actually used. But if you're curious, there is a way that we could make this actually work with no cinching. Remembering that true 360 is created out of two lenses pointing in opposite directions, the starburst effect only simulates what we would see looking in one direction. To simulate the perspective of rain in both directions, we're going to start with the one direction first. Right now, this is simulating sort of the front view, and the VR converter effect is still set to only simulate 180 degrees, in other words, 1/2 of a 360 camera. Now within the VR converter effect, you can adjust the camera rotation, meaning what angle was the camera supposedly looking in to show that view. If we rotate 90 degrees on the y-axis, this pushes the view to the right of our equirectangular because that translates to the right lens of the camera. But we want to simulate a view from above, not to the right. So we bring the y-axis back to 0 and this time rotate on the x-axis. Rotating on this x-axis is like turning the 360 camera so that the lenses face up and down. In the equirectangular, we're seeing our image stretched up to the top and across the entire length of the video. This makes sense as when it gets wrapped around, the two sides will meet at the back and the top will be cinched into that point. Now all we have to do is duplicate this layer and rotate it on the x-axis 90 degrees the other way, simulating the bottom lens and also squishing it out to the bottom of our image. We're super close, but obviously we still have a big problem. The rain on the bottom half should be going the other direction. This is an easy fix. We just go into the CC starburst effect and change the speed to be negative. So now the particles go in the opposite direction. This gives us a continuous flow of particles from top all the way to the bottom. Technically in the middle there is a seam, which is really imperceptible with this effect. However, for other effects and stuff, if you really want to smooth this out, you can just use the linear wipe effects to crop and feather the two edges. But this is it, guys. A finished product where the particles go from top to bottom. The left and right sides, when stretched around the sphere, will line up perfectly, and the tops and bottoms have that pre-stretch, which means when they are re-cinched to the tops and bottoms of our sphere, we actually recreate correct videos of a CC starburst effect coming down at us from above, and a CC starburst effect going away from us down below. 360 particle environments finally done with After Effects. Or, as I've learned since, you can do entire 360 rain simulations in 3D with Blender by creating a rain droplet, turning a plane into a rain emitter, plopping in a camera, and then just set the output render to panoramic with the type equirectangular. You can download the Blender file and the resulting animation via a link in the description. Once I finished the entire scene for Cliff and put it in the rest of the video, then it hit me that I could actually re-upload the entire Cliff scene without the 3D camera animation in its raw omnidirectional format, put it on YouTube, and let the viewer look around the entire scene. And this totally blew my mind. I'm a noob to 360, but this was super cool. Basically, all I had to do was take off the adjustment layer with the GoPro reframe effect, and I had a 360 equirectangular ready for YouTube. But I decided to go a little further and build another version of the scene a little bit more tailored for 360. Now in the official video, the transition from Cliff back to Alec is when he's on a record player. Now I couldn't show this record player scene in the 360 version because the record player shot is done with an actual camera, not a 360 camera. But then it occurred to me, what if we could still put Cliff on a record player in 360? I had already had practice putting Cliff on other backgrounds, why not a record player? So I went out, got my 360 camera, put some tape on it, hung it in Alec Hudson's room above a record player, and let it run. I brought the footage back into Premiere, put it underneath the Cliff footage, did some adjustments with the reframe plugin, and it worked. I had Cliff now driving on a real record player in real 360, which is super cool. And you can look around the room and look at Cliff, and he's on the record player. And I was super proud of that. And so I just let it run to the rest of the video. There's a lot of like Easter eggs and things that I placed in the room. Like, for example, if you look up this disco ball, which I made using a combination of fractal noise, mosaic, grid lines, and then the CC sphere effect we talked about in the overlays section. The disco ball lights are actually just a frozen version of the CC snowfall effect, and then the VR converter effect, which we talked about earlier in this 360 section, to make it react with 360. I also added a little bit of a displacement map to make the highlighted dots kind of look like they're hugging the surfaces. And last but not least, if you look to the right, the entire video playing on Alex's wall, which was done using the plane to sphere effect right in Premiere, which we talked about also in this 360 section. And there you have it. A nice fun way to experiment with 360 and end the true Cliff 360 version of this video, which is on my YouTube channel and also pops up at the end of the original video. I really love it. If you take a look at it, let me know what you think. It was a fun experiment working with 360. I think it turned out awesome. Yeah. Like a lot of my projects, I learned a ton while working on Zebra. Everything from how to work with drones and 360 footage, pretty much first time in my life, to other composition effects like Colorama. I learned about projection mapping, and I learned a lot more about Mocha tracking. Now, these are some of my following tips that I have for other people. Tip 1. Only shoot day for night on cloudy days. If you film day for night on a sunny day, you will have a nightmare of a time trying to make it look like night. 2. Get feedback as much as possible. The early feedback I got was basically that the video was kind of confusing and didn't have a very clear visual theme. So I had more of the time wipe effects and contrasty pattern effects, and future feedback was much better. Now, you don't have to go crazy with this feedback gathering, and in some cases you'll actually get conflicting feedback on the same scene. In those cases, it's actually pretty cool. It's just a sign that it's art and really up to you. Now, the last but probably most important tip I have for filmmakers who are trying to make films on low to no budget, but high complexity or concept, is that you've got to learn to play. To me, playing is basically low stakes, high experimentation. It is trying things fast and not really caring too much if they don't work out, learning from that, but also being keen to spot when things do work out, either on purpose or by accident. When things do work out though, one thing that I had to learn in this project is it doesn't mean that's the right solution. That's an important sort of next level lesson that I learned. When something does work out, great, make note of it, but keep experimenting. There might be something that also works and works faster and cheaper. The whole process of making this video was kind of like making a log cabin from tree seeds. We started with concepts, weren't sure how they'd grow, and when they started to grow, they were becoming big, bushy, complicated trees that needed to be trimmed back, making them into usable logs. Even then, once we had these logs of working concepts, it turned out some of them were bent or didn't fit the rest of the building and had to be tossed aside and new concepts grown to replace them. And building the whole thing without a blueprint meant lots of trimming, timing, reframing, color correcting, and cleaning up all just to the very last minute to make a pretty cool looking video house. Now, if you want to see some of those discarded twigs and logs that didn't make the final cut, I'm going to be putting them on my Instagram. Thank you so much for watching. I know this has been a bit of a long video, and I really appreciate you sticking around to the end. I hope you guys learned something, and if you have any other questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. Or head over to the Discord channel where I will answer all of your questions. Thank you guys so much for being a patron. And of course, also subscribe to Alec Hudson. He's a fantastic musician. Same with Cliff Notes and any other artists that were working on this video, which I'll put in the description below. Cool. See you guys later.
Life is just a series.
Don't look at me. What is Phil doing?
He's trying.
Don't actually drink it, Phil. Can you look way fucking sadder? Okay, thank you.